The coffee shop erupted in laughter when Marcus Chen spilled his drink all over himself during the morning rush. But 30 seconds later, every person in that room would fall dead silent when they saw what was tattooed on his forearm. What they discovered that day would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet guy who worked the weekend shift at their local electronics store. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Bell Electronics store on Maple Street wasn't the kind of place that attracted much excitement. Tucked between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop in downtown Riverside, Ohio, it served the basic needs of locals who needed phone chargers, batteries, or the occasional laptop repair. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, casting everything in that particular shade of retail white that made even the newest merchandise look slightly tired. Marcus Chen had been working the weekend shifts there for 8 months. At 28, he was older than most of the other part-time employees, and his quiet demeanor made him nearly invisible among the more outgoing college kids who dominated the weekday schedules. He wore simple clothes, usually dark jeans and plain t-shirts, and kept his hair neat and short. When customers approached him, he was polite and knowledgeable, but he never lingered for small talk the way his coworkers did. The other employees had their theories about Marcus. Some thought he was just antisocial. Others figured he was probably working his way through community college, trying to save money like everyone else. A few suspected he might be one of those guys who still lived with his parents and spent all his free time playing video games in a basement somewhere. Nobody really knew, and Marcus never volunteered information about his life outside the store. What they did know was that he was reliable. He showed up exactly on time for every shift, never called in sick, and handled even the most difficult customers with an almost mechanical calm that impressed the managers. When the store's ancient computer system crashed during Black Friday weekend, Marcus had worked 16 hours straight to manually process transactions and keep the lines moving. He never complained, never asked for extra breaks, and never seemed fazed by the chaos that sent other employees into panic mode. But reliable didn't mean respected. The younger employees viewed Marcus as boring, and some of the regulars barely acknowledged his existence. He was just the quiet guy who rang up their purchases and wished them a good day in the same even tone he used with everyone. The morning everything changed like any other Saturday. Marcus arrived at 6:45 a.m. to open the store, 15 minutes before his shift officially began. He unlocked the doors, disabled the alarm system, and began the opening routine he'd performed hundreds of times before. The cash registers needed to be counted, the displays straightened, and the previous day's returns processed before customers started arriving at 8. By 7:30, the other weekend employees had trickled in. There was Jessica Martinez, a sophomore at Ohio State who was majoring in business and never missed an opportunity to mention her internship applications. Then came David Brooks, a 19-year-old who worked part-time while finishing his associate's degree in computer science. Both of them were friendly enough with each other and with Marcus, but there was always an undertone of condescension in their interactions with him, like they were temporary visitors in retail while he was a permanent resident. The Saturday morning routine was always the same. Around 9:30, after the initial rush of early shoppers had died down, the three of them would take turns making coffee runs to the Starbucks 2 blocks away. It was Jessica's turn that morning, and she returned with her usual elaborate order and simpler drinks for the others. Marcus had asked for black coffee, no sugar, which earned her the usual eye roll from Jessica. "I don't know how you drink that stuff straight," she said, setting the cup down on the counter behind the register. "It's fine," Marcus replied, not looking up from the inventory sheet he was reviewing. This was typical. He rarely engaged with their attempts at casual conversation. David was stocking phone cases nearby and overheard the exchange. "You know what's weird about Marcus?" he said to Jessica, speaking loud enough that Marcus did clearly hear him. "I've never seen him eat lunch, like ever. He just sits in the break room during his break and stares at his phone." "Maybe he's on some kind of diet," Jessica suggested, though her tone suggested she found this unlikely. "Or maybe he's just too weird to eat normal food," David continued. "I bet he goes home and eats nothing but ramen noodles and energy drinks, classic basement dweller behavior." Marcus continued working on his inventory, showing no reaction to their speculation about his personal life. This wasn't unusual. He developed a remarkable ability to tune out the casual cruelty that seemed to be a standard part of retail work. But something about that morning felt different. Maybe it was the way David's voice carried just a little too much genuine disdain, or maybe it was the knowing look that passed between his two coworkers. Whatever it was, the atmosphere in the store felt more charged than usual. The morning progressed without incident until around 11:15 when Marcus reached for his coffee cup while helping a customer with a phone repair. The cup was sitting on the narrow ledge behind the register, and as he turned to grab it, his elbow knocked it sideways. The black coffee splashed across the counter and down the front of his gray t-shirt, creating a dark stain that spread from his chest to his waist. "Oh, come on," Jessica laughed from across the store. "How do you even manage that?" David looked up from the tablet display he was organizing. "Smooth move, Marcus. Maybe stick to sippy cups next time." The customer Marcus was helping, an elderly man getting his phone screen replaced, looked sympathetic. "Happens to the best of us, son. You got somewhere to clean that up?" Marcus nodded toward the back of the store. "There's a sink in the break room. Give me just a minute to get this sorted out." As he walked toward the break room, he could hear Jessica and David continuing their commentary. "I swear, that guy is like a walking disaster sometimes," Jessica said. "Right, like how hard is it to drink coffee without wearing it?" David replied. "No wonder he can't get a real job." Marcus pushed through the door into the break room and began pulling paper towels from the dispenser. The coffee had soaked through his shirt completely, and he knew he'd need to change into the spare shirt he kept in his locker for exactly this kind of situation. He pulled the stained shirt off over his head and tossed it into the sink, then turned toward his locker. That's when Jessica walked in. She'd come to grab something from the refrigerator, but she stopped dead in the doorway when she saw Marcus standing there without his shirt. Her eyes went immediately to his left forearm, where a tattoo ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow in stark black lettering. The words were simple, but they hit her like a physical blow. "Death from above, 82nd Airborne." Below that, in smaller text, "Operation Enduring Freedom 2018-2020." And at the very bottom, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into her vision, "Ghost Company." Jessica's mouth fell open. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Marcus noticed her staring and glanced down at his arm, then back at her face. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw something different in his eyes. Not the mild, distant politeness he usually showed, but something much deeper and more complex. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I was a lot of things," Marcus said, reaching for his spare shirt in the locker. "But right now, I'm just a guy who spilled coffee on himself." He pulled the clean shirt over his head, covering the tattoo, but Jessica couldn't stop staring at where it had been. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the quiet, unremarkable coworker she thought she knew with the words she'd just seen permanently marked on his skin. Ghost Company. She'd heard that name before, though she couldn't immediately place where. Something about Afghanistan, something about operations that didn't make the news. Marcus finished getting dressed and turned back toward the door. "You should probably get back out there," he said. "David's probably wondering where you went." Jessica nodded mutely and stepped aside to let him pass. As he walked by her, she caught a glimpse of something else. A small scar along his jawline that she'd never noticed before, and another one disappearing into his hairline near his left temple. Suddenly, the way he carried himself looked different. The way he scanned rooms when he entered them looked different. Even the way he'd handled that angry customer last month, with a calm that had seemed almost supernatural, looked different. Marcus returned to the front of the store and resumed helping the elderly customer with his phone repair, acting as if nothing had happened. But Jessica remained frozen in the break room doorway, her mind struggling to process what she'd just learned about the man she'd been casually dismissing for the better part of a year. Ghost Company. Death from above. Operation Enduring Freedom. The quiet guy who rang up phone chargers and never complained about working 16-hour shifts wasn't who any of them had thought he was. Not even close. Jessica stayed in the break room for almost 10 minutes, her hands shaking as she tried to piece together what she'd just witnessed. Ghost Company wasn't just some random military unit. She'd seen a documentary about Afghanistan operations, and that name had come up in connection with some of the most classified missions of the entire war. The kind of operations that were briefed to Congress behind closed doors and never discussed in public. When she finally emerged, Marcus was finishing up with the elderly customer, explaining how the new screen protector would prevent future damage. His voice was the same calm, patient tone he always used, but now Jessica heard something different in it, a measured control that seemed almost rehearsed, like he was consciously modulating every word. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. David was reorganizing the gaming headset display and looked up when Jessica appeared. "What took you so long? Did you get lost in there?" "I was just—" Jessica started, then stopped. She glanced at Marcus, who was now wiping down the counter where the coffee had spilled. "I was just cleaning up some stuff." The rest of the morning passed in a strange haze for Jessica. Every time she looked at Marcus, she found herself studying details she'd never paid attention to before. The way he moved through the store wasn't just efficient, it was economical, with no wasted motion. When customers approached the counter, he positioned himself at a slight angle that kept his back protected and his hands free. When the delivery truck arrived with new inventory, he automatically scanned the parking lot before stepping outside to help unload boxes. These weren't the habits of someone who'd spent his adult life in retail. They were the instincts of someone who'd been trained to survive in places where a moment's inattention could mean death. Around 1:30, during the afternoon lull, David was scrolling through his phone behind the counter when he came across a news article that made him look up with sudden interest. "Hey, check this out," he said, holding up his phone. "There's this story about some veteran who stopped a robbery at a gas station in Cleveland last week. Guy apparently took down 3 armed dudes with his bare hands." Jessica felt her stomach clench. "Really?" "Yeah, and get this, the guy was just some regular customer buying lottery tickets. Nobody had any idea he was ex-military until he basically turned into a one-man army." David laughed. "I love those stories. Like, imagine thinking you're robbing some random dude and it turns out he's secretly G.I. Joe or something." Marcus continued stocking batteries on a nearby shelf, showing no reaction to the conversation. But Jessica noticed that his movements had slowed slightly, like he was listening more carefully than he appeared to be. "What branch was he?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice casual. David scrolled through the article. "Doesn't say specifically. Just mentions he served in Afghanistan and had specialized training, whatever that means. Probably just boot camp and a desk job," David continued dismissively. "Most of these guys who claim to be super soldiers were probably mechanics or cooks or something. But the media loves to make it sound all mysterious and badass." Jessica watched Marcus carefully as David spoke. There was no visible reaction, but something in his posture seemed to tighten almost imperceptibly. The afternoon continued without incident until around 4 o'clock, when a customer came in who would change everything. He was a man in his mid-50s, wearing a weathered leather jacket and jeans. He had the kind of bearing that immediately suggested military service, straight-backed and alert, with eyes that took in everything around him as he walked through the store. He approached the counter where Marcus was working and set down a broken tablet. "I need to see if this can be salvaged," he said. "My grandson dropped it, and his mother's gonna kill us both if we can't get his schoolwork off of it." As Marcus examined the device, the customer studied his face. "You look familiar," he said after a moment. "Did we serve together somewhere?" Marcus glanced up briefly, then returned his attention to the tablet. "I don't think so, sir. Let me take a look at this screen and see what we're working with." But the customer wasn't giving up. "No, I'm sure I know you from somewhere. What unit were you with?" The question hung in the air for several seconds. Jessica, who was pretending to organize inventory nearby, felt her heart rate spike. David looked up from his phone with mild interest. I wasn't military, Marcus said quietly, still focused on the tablet. The customer's eyebrows rose. Really? Because you've got the bearing. And the way you're handling that device, checking for structural damage, looking for impact points, systematic assessment, that's not civilian training. Marcus set the tablet down and looked directly at the customer for the first time. The screen is cracked, but the internal components look intact. I can probably recover the data, but you'll need a complete screen replacement. It'll take about an hour if you want to wait. I'll wait, the customer said, settling into one of the chairs near the counter. And I'm betting you were 82nd Airborne. Am I right? Jessica nearly dropped the phone case she was holding. The customer had just named the exact unit she'd seen tattooed on Marcus's arm. Marcus paused in his work, his hand still on the tablet. For the first time since Jessica had known him, he seemed genuinely unsettled. "What makes you say that?" he asked. 26 years of Army, the customer replied. First sergeant, retired. You develop an eye for these things. The way you move, the way you assess situations, the way you just took apart that tablet. You weren't just Army, you were specialty trained. And that haircut might be civilian length now, but it grew out from a high and tight. David was now paying full attention to the conversation, sensing that something significant was happening, even if he didn't understand what. Plus, the customer continued, I was deployed to Bagram from 2018 to 2019. I heard a lot of stories about ghost company operations during that time. Some of the most effective small unit actions of the entire deployment. Word was those guys could make problems disappear without anyone even knowing they'd been there. Jessica felt the blood drain from her face. Ghost company. He'd just said ghost company. Marcus had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the customer's face. The easy civilian mask he'd worn for 8 months had slipped entirely, replaced by something harder and more focused. "You heard stories," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I heard the results," the customer corrected. "Taliban supply lines that just stopped functioning. High-value targets who vanished from compounds that looked untouched from the outside. Roadside bomb networks that went dark overnight with no explanation." He leaned forward slightly. "The kind of work that keeps a lot of people alive, but nobody talks about it because it was too effective to acknowledge publicly." The store had fallen completely silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights. David was staring back and forth between Marcus and the customer like he was watching a tennis match. Jessica was barely breathing. "Sergeant Chen," the customer said softly. "It is Chen, isn't it? Marcus Chen, Ghost Company, 2nd Battalion?" Marcus straightened slowly, and suddenly Jessica could see exactly what the customer had recognized. The way Marcus carried himself wasn't just confident. It was the posture of someone who'd been responsible for other people's lives in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The calm that had seemed almost robotic now looked like the product of intense training and experience under pressure that most people couldn't even imagine. "First Sergeant Williams," Marcus said, his voice different now, more direct, with an edge of respect that hadn't been there before. "Bagram Forward Operating Base." "That's right. I remember the briefings about your unit's operations. Never got details, but we always knew when Ghost Company had been active because the threat level in our sector would drop for weeks afterward." Williams smiled grimly. "What the hell are you doing fixing tablets in Ohio?" Marcus glanced around the store, suddenly seeming to remember where he was. David and Jessica were both staring at him with expressions of complete shock. A couple of customers browsing in the back of the store had noticed the conversation and were watching with curiosity. "Just trying to keep busy," Marcus said, his voice returning to its usual even tone. "Let me get this tablet fixed for you." But Williams wasn't letting it go. "Sergeant Chen, you were part of some of the most classified operations in Afghanistan, the kind of missions that required security clearances most generals don't have. And now you're working retail?" "Things change," Marcus replied, beginning to disassemble the tablet with steady, precise movements. "Not things like that," Williams said firmly. Skills like yours don't just disappear because you put on civilian clothes. Training like yours doesn't just get forgotten because you're not carrying a weapon anymore. Jessica watched this exchange with growing amazement. The Marcus she thought she knew, the quiet guy who spilled coffee and never complained about difficult customers, was apparently someone who'd conducted classified military operations in Afghanistan. Someone who'd been trusted with missions so sensitive that even other military personnel weren't briefed on the details. David finally found his voice. "Wait, Marcus, you were actually in the military?" Marcus looked at him briefly, then returned his attention to the tablet repair. "For a while. But you never said anything," David continued, his voice taking on a different tone, less casual, more respectful. "I mean, we've been working together for months." "It didn't seem relevant," Marcus replied. Williams laughed, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Didn't seem relevant? Son, do you have any idea what this man did for his country? What did the Ghost Company accomplish during that deployment?" The question hung in the air, and Jessica realized that none of them, not her, not David, not probably anyone in Marcus's civilian life, had any real understanding of who they'd been working alongside for the past 8 months. "Ghost Company conducted operations that officially never happened," Williams continued. "They went places other units couldn't go, did things other units couldn't do, and came back with results that changed the entire strategic picture in eastern Afghanistan. And they did it all with a success rate that was basically unheard of." Marcus had finished removing the broken screen and was now carefully extracting data from the tablet's internal memory. His movements were precise and methodical, but Jessica could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "The unit I served with had the highest mission success rate of any special operations group in theater during 2018 and 2019. 0 casualties, 0 compromised operations, 0 mission failures. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen with average soldiers." Jessica felt like she was discovering that her quiet coworker was actually a completely different person. Everything about Marcus that had seemed unremarkable now appeared to be carefully constructed camouflage. The man who'd never missed a day of work, never complained about difficult customers, and handled every crisis with supernatural calm wasn't just reliable. He was someone who'd been trained to function effectively under the most extreme pressure imaginable. And for 8 months, he'd been hiding in plain sight behind a retail uniform and a name tag, letting people like her and David treat him like he was just another minimum wage worker who couldn't find anything better. The tablet repair took Marcus exactly 43 minutes. During that time, First Sergeant Williams shared stories that fundamentally altered how everyone in that store understood the quiet man behind the counter. He spoke carefully, never revealing operational details that remained classified, but painting a picture of Ghost Company that made David's earlier comments about desk jockeys and basement dwellers seem not just wrong, but almost insulting. "The thing about units like Ghost Company," Williams explained while Marcus worked, "is that they don't exist on any organizational chart you'll ever see. They don't get parade ceremonies or media coverage. Hell, most of the Army doesn't even know they exist. But when something absolutely positively has to go right the first time, with no backup plan and no room for error, those are the people who get the call." Marcus had replaced the tablet screen and was now running diagnostic tests to ensure all the data had been successfully recovered. His movements were precise and methodical, but Jessica could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "The unit I served with had the highest mission success rate of any special operations group in theater during 2018 and 2019. 0 casualties, 0 compromised operations, 0 mission failures. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen with average soldiers." Jessica felt like she was discovering that her quiet coworker was actually a completely different person. Everything about Marcus that had seemed unremarkable now appeared to be carefully constructed camouflage. The man who'd never missed a day of work, never complained about difficult customers, and handled every crisis with supernatural calm, wasn't just reliable. He was someone who'd been trained to function effectively under the most extreme pressure imaginable. And for 8 months, he'd been hiding in plain sight behind a retail uniform and a name tag, letting people like her and David treat him like he was just another minimum wage worker who couldn't find anything better. The tablet repair took Marcus exactly 43 minutes. During that time, First Sergeant Williams shared stories that fundamentally altered how everyone in that store understood the quiet man behind the counter. He spoke carefully, never revealing operational details that remained classified, but painting a picture of Ghost Company that made David's earlier comments about desk jockeys and basement dwellers seem not just wrong, but almost insulting. The thing about units like Ghost Company, Williams explained while Marcus worked, is that they don't exist on any organizational chart you'll ever see. They don't get parade ceremonies or media coverage. Hell, most of the Army doesn't even know they exist. But when something absolutely positively has to go right the first time, with no backup plan and no room for error, those are the people who get the call. Marcus had replaced the tablet screen and was now running diagnostic tests to ensure all the data had been successfully recovered. His hands moved with the same steady precision he'd shown every day for 8 months, but now Jessica could see it differently. Those weren't just the careful movements of a retail employee. They were the habits of someone who'd been trained to work under pressure where a single mistake could have catastrophic consequences. And for 8 months, he'd been hiding in plain sight behind a retail uniform and a name tag, letting people like her and David treat him like he was just another minimum wage worker who couldn't find anything better. Jessica found herself studying Marcus's face as he worked. She'd always thought his expression was just naturally calm, maybe a little distant. Now she realized it was something else entirely, the kind of controlled composure that came from operating in environments where showing emotion or losing focus could get people killed. The average deployment for most soldiers in Afghanistan was 12 months, Williams continued. Ghost Company operators typically did 18-month deployments, sometimes longer, because their skill sets were too valuable to rotate out on normal schedules. And they didn't operate from major bases with full support staff and regular supply lines. They worked out of forward positions that most soldiers never even knew existed. Marcus finished the diagnostic tests and looked up at Williams. "Your grandson's tablet is ready. All the data has been recovered and the new screen should hold up better than the original." Williams took the device and examined Marcus's work. "Perfect job, as expected. What do I owe you?" $65 for the screen, no charge for the data recovery. As Williams pulled out his wallet, he continued talking to the small audience that had gathered around the counter. "You know what the most impressive thing about Ghost Company was? It wasn't the missions they completed, though those were remarkable. It was how they handled coming back home. Most special operations soldiers struggle with the transition to civilian life. The skills that keep you alive in combat don't always translate well to peacetime." Marcus was processing the payment, but Jessica could see that Williams's words were affecting him in ways that weren't entirely comfortable. "But Ghost Company operators were different," Williams went on. "They were trained not just to excel in combat, but to blend seamlessly into civilian society afterward, to take their extraordinary skills and apply them to ordinary situations, to be remarkable people living unremarkable lives, helping their communities in ways that nobody would ever recognize or appreciate." The cash register chimed as the transaction completed, but Williams made no move to leave. "The question is, Sergeant Chen, are you actually living an ordinary life, or are you just pretending to?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus handed Williams his receipt and change, but his expression had become unreadable again. "I'm living the life I chose," Marcus said simply. "Are you?" Williams pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're hiding, and that's not what Ghost Company trained you to do." Before Marcus could respond, the electronic chime at the front door announced a new customer. But this wasn't a typical Saturday shopper looking for phone accessories. Three men in their 20s had entered the store, and something about their demeanor immediately set Jessica on edge. They moved with an aggressive swagger, speaking loudly and making crude comments about the merchandise displays. Marcus's entire body language changed instantly. The shift was so subtle that Jessica might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him so intently. But suddenly he was hyper-alert, his eyes tracking the newcomers while his hands remained casually positioned near the counter. Williams noticed the change too. "Trouble?" he asked quietly. "Maybe," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "David, go check the inventory in the back room. Jessica, find something to organize near the rear exit." Neither of them questioned the instructions. Something in Marcus's tone made it clear that this wasn't a suggestion. The three men approached the counter, and Jessica could smell alcohol on their breath even from several feet away. The one in front, a heavy-set guy with prison tattoos covering his forearms, leaned against the counter and grinned at Marcus with undisguised hostility. "Hey there, buddy," he said, his words slightly slurred. "We're looking for some expensive stuff. You know, tablets, laptops, maybe some of those fancy phones you keep locked up." "I'd be happy to show you what we have," Marcus replied, his voice returning to the same polite, professional tone he used with every customer. "Oh, we're interested in everything," the second man said, moving to position himself near the front door. "Especially the stuff in your cash register." The situation became crystal clear to everyone in the store simultaneously. This wasn't a shopping trip, it was a robbery in progress. Jessica felt her heart start racing, and she glanced toward Williams, who had tensed but remained seated in his chair near the counter. The third man had moved toward the back of the store, presumably to block any escape routes. He was bigger than the other two, with the kind of muscle mass that suggested he spent serious time in a gym, probably a prison gym. The leader continued, reaching into his jacket. "You're going to open that register, and then you're going to open the locked cases with all the expensive merchandise. And if you're really smart about it, nobody gets hurt." Marcus nodded calmly. "Of course, just let me get my manager's key for the locked cases." He started to move toward the back office, but the leader grabbed his arm. "Nice try, hero. You're staying right here where I can see you. Use whatever keys you've got, or we'll find another way into those cases." That's when Marcus made his move. It happened so fast that Jessica's eyes couldn't follow the sequence of actions. One second, the robber was holding Marcus's arm. The next second, the robber was on the floor with his arm bent at an unnatural angle, gasping for breath and making sounds that weren't quite words. The man near the door started to reach for his own weapon, but Marcus was already moving. He covered the distance between the counter and the entrance in 3 quick steps that seemed to flow like water. And suddenly, the second robber was unconscious on the floor, with blood trickling from his nose. The third man, the big one near the back of the store, had enough time to actually draw a gun before Marcus reached him. But having a weapon and being able to use it effectively turned out to be very different things. Marcus's hand moved in a blur, and the gun went flying across the store, while its former owner collapsed to his knees, clutching his wrist and howling. The entire confrontation lasted less than 15 seconds. Marcus stood in the center of the store, breathing normally and showing no signs of exertion. The 3 would-be robbers were on the floor in various states of consciousness, none of them in any condition to continue their criminal enterprise. "David?" Marcus called toward the back room, his voice still perfectly calm. "Could you call 911, please? We have 3 customers who are going to need medical attention." Jessica stared at the scene in complete shock. The transformation she'd witnessed was beyond anything she could have imagined. The quiet, unremarkable coworker she'd known for 8 months had just neutralized 3 armed criminals with the kind of efficiency that belonged in action movies, not electronics stores. Williams was sitting in his chair with a satisfied smile on his face. "Now that," he said, "is what ghost company training looks like in practice." Marcus was already checking on the 3 injured men, ensuring their airways were clear and their injuries weren't life-threatening. His movements were professional and methodical, like he'd been trained in field medicine as well as combat techniques. "Sir," he said to Williams, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention the military connection when the police arrived. These men attempted an armed robbery, and they were subdued by a civilian employee using reasonable force to protect himself and his coworkers." "Reasonable force?" Jessica managed to say. "Marcus, you just took down 3 guys like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Marcus replied, kneeling beside the unconscious robber and checking his pulse. "But it was necessary, and it was proportional to the threat they represented." The leader of the group had regained enough consciousness to try sitting up. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What the hell are you, man?" Marcus met his eyes with the same calm expression he'd worn while helping customers pick out phone cases. "I'm just a guy who works at an electronics store," he said, "but I don't like it when people threaten my coworkers." Sirens were audible in the distance, growing closer by the second. Marcus stood up and brushed off his hands, then walked back to the counter and began straightening the merchandise that had been disturbed during the brief confrontation. "Jessica," he said, "could you please put together an incident report for the manager? David, make sure the security cameras catch everything we're going to need for the police report." He was giving instructions like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just demonstrated combat skills that belonged to an entirely different world than retail sales. But Jessica could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of alertness that suggested the civilian mask he'd worn for 8 months was going to be much harder to maintain from now on. Williams approached the counter as police cars pulled into the parking lot. "Sergeant Chen," he said quietly, "that was impressive work. But you know this changes everything, right?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "Changes what?" "The pretending," Williams replied. "After what just happened, you can't go back to acting like you're just another retail employee. Your coworkers have seen who you really are. Hell, half the town is going to know by tomorrow." Marcus glanced at Jessica and David, both of whom were staring at him with expressions that mixed admiration, confusion, and just a touch of fear. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said finally. The first police officer pushed through the front door, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. 3 suspects on the floor, 2 employees and 2 customers standing calmly nearby, no signs of property damage except for a few scattered phone cases. "Is everyone okay here?" the officer asked. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "We had 3 individuals attempt an armed robbery. They were subdued using necessary force. The weapons they brought are secured, and we have security footage of the entire incident." The officer looked at the 3 men on the floor, then back at Marcus. "You did this yourself?" "I defended my workplace and my coworkers," Marcus said. As more officers arrived and began processing the scene, Jessica realized that everything was about to change, not just for Marcus, but for all of them. The quiet weekend shifts at Bell Electronics, the casual workplace dynamics, the comfortable routine they'd all settled into. All of that belonged to a time before they knew who Marcus Chen really was. And there was no going back. The police station buzzed with unusual energy that Saturday evening. Word had spread quickly through the Riverside Police Department about the electronics store incident. 3 armed robbers taken down by a single employee using what witnesses described as professional-level defensive techniques. Detective Sarah Monroe had seen plenty of self-defense situations in her 12 years on the force, but this case was different. She reviewed the security footage for the 3rd time, watching Marcus Chen's movements frame by frame. The speed and precision weren't accidental or lucky. Every action was deliberate, controlled, and executed with a level of expertise that suggested extensive training. The kind of training that didn't come from weekend martial arts classes or YouTube videos. "Detective Monroe?" Officer Rodriguez appeared in her doorway. "The store employee is ready for his statement." Marcus sat in the interview room with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the evening. He'd answered every preliminary question directly and thoroughly, providing exactly the information requested without volunteering additional details. His statement was consistent, clear, and completely unremarkable except for the fact that he'd single-handedly stopped an armed robbery. "Mr. Chen," Detective Monroe began, settling into the chair across from him. "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I have to say, what you did today was extraordinary. Most people would have been terrified." "It happened very quickly," Marcus replied. "I just reacted to protect my coworkers." "Right, but here's what's interesting to me," Monroe continued, opening her case file. "Your reaction involved disarming 3 men, 2 of whom were carrying firearms, using techniques that required precise knowledge of anatomy, leverage points, and pressure application. That's not instinct, that's training." Marcus remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "So, I did some checking," Monroe said, pulling out a printed document. "Military service records are usually pretty straightforward, but yours required some special clearances to access. Turns out you weren't just Army. You were 82nd Airborne, Specialized Operations, deployed to Afghanistan from 2018 to 2020. She paused, studying his face for any reaction. "What's really interesting is that most of your service record is classified at levels that require federal authorization to access. That doesn't happen for regular infantry soldiers, Mr. Chen." "I served my country to the best of my ability," Marcus said simply. "When my enlistment ended, I chose to pursue civilian employment." "Civilian employment at an electronics store," Monroe observed. "Don't you think that's a bit of a career change for someone with your background?" "Honest work is honest work, Detective." Monroe leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Chen, I'm not trying to give you a hard time here. What you did today probably saved lives. But I need to understand what we're dealing with. Those 3 men you subdued, 2 of them have extensive criminal records, including armed robbery and assault. The 3rd one is suspected in at least 4 similar robberies across 3 counties. They weren't amateurs." "I'm glad they've been taken off the streets," Marcus replied. "Here's what bothers me," Monroe continued. "Professional criminals don't usually target small electronics stores for major scores. They go after banks, jewelry stores, places with significant cash or high-value merchandise. But these guys specifically chose Bell Electronics on a Saturday afternoon when they knew you'd be working." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Monroe caught a slight shift in his posture. "What are you suggesting, Detective?" "I'm suggesting that maybe this wasn't a random robbery attempt. Maybe someone told them about the quiet guy who works weekends at the electronics store. Maybe they thought they were picking an easy target." The implication hung between them for several moments. Monroe had seen enough cases to recognize when criminals had been given inside information about potential victims. The idea that someone had deliberately set Marcus up as what they thought would be an easy mark added a disturbing dimension to the incident. "Detective," Marcus said carefully, "are you asking if I have enemies? I'm asking if your military service might have created situations where certain people would want to see you hurt, humiliated, or worse." Marcus was quiet for a long time, considering the question. "My unit conducted operations that disrupted several criminal networks operating in Afghanistan. Some of those networks had connections to criminal organizations in the United States. It's possible that information about former Ghost Company members has been shared among certain groups." It was the first time he'd mentioned Ghost Company by name, and Monroe immediately understood the significance. She'd heard whispers about specialty units operating in Afghanistan, groups that handled missions too sensitive for regular military channels. If Marcus had been part of something like that, it would explain both his extraordinary skills and the potential for ongoing security concerns. "Mr. Chen, do you believe you're in danger?" "I believe that what happened today was an isolated incident that has been resolved," Marcus replied. But his tone suggested he was being diplomatic rather than entirely truthful. Meanwhile, back at Bell Electronics, the aftermath of the robbery attempt was creating ripple effects that no one had anticipated. Store manager Patricia Wells had arrived within an hour of the incident, followed shortly by regional supervisors and corporate security personnel. What should have been a routine post-incident evaluation had turned into something much more complex. Jessica and David were giving their statements to corporate investigators, and both were struggling to reconcile their previous perceptions of Marcus with what they'd witnessed. The quiet coworker who'd seemed almost invisible for 8 months had revealed capabilities that belonged in a completely different category of human being. "I keep thinking about all the times we made jokes about him," David said during a break in his interview. "Like, remember when that drunk guy came in last month and started getting aggressive with customers? Marcus just walked over and said something to him, and the guy immediately calmed down and left." Jessica nodded. "I thought he just got lucky that time, but now it makes sense," David finished. "The guy probably took one look at Marcus and realized he was dealing with someone who could handle himself." Patricia Wells, who had managed retail stores for 15 years, was having her own moment of realization. She'd hired Marcus based on his application and interview, which had presented him as a reliable candidate with military experience seeking steady employment. Nothing in his paperwork had suggested he was anything other than a former soldier transitioning to civilian work. But reviewing his employment record revealed patterns she hadn't noticed before. Marcus had never called in sick, never been late, never failed to handle difficult situations effectively. His customer service scores were consistently perfect, not because he was exceptionally friendly, but because he possessed an almost supernatural ability to de-escalate conflicts and solve problems. "The thing is," she told the corporate investigators, "I always thought he was overqualified for the position. His interview responses were too polished, his references were too good, and he never complained about the wage or asked about advancement opportunities. It was like he didn't care about building a career in retail." "What did you think he was doing here?" the lead investigator asked. "Honestly, I thought he was probably dealing with some kind of personal issue, maybe financial problems, family situation, something that made him need a simple job while he got his life sorted out. I never." She gestured toward the security monitor showing footage of Marcus neutralizing 3 armed men with movements that looked choreographed in their precision. "I never imagined he was capable of that." The investigation was complicated by the fact that Marcus's actions, while extraordinary, were entirely legal. He had used necessary force to protect himself and others from imminent threat. The 3 attackers had been armed, had made explicit threats, and had attempted to commit multiple felonies. Any reasonable person would conclude that Marcus had acted appropriately. But the manner in which he'd acted raised questions that went beyond simple self-defense. The techniques he'd used weren't taught in civilian self-defense classes or standard military training. They suggested specialized instruction in close-quarters combat, the kind of training reserved for soldiers who operated in environments where conventional rules of engagement didn't apply. By evening, word of the incident had spread throughout Riverside. The local news was calling it a real-life action hero, and social media was buzzing with second-hand accounts that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Marcus Chen, who had spent 8 months flying completely under the radar, had become the most talked-about person in town. At his apartment that night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table reviewing the day's events. The small one-bedroom unit was spartanly furnished, a deliberate choice that reflected both his military background and his desire to maintain a low profile. But scattered around the apartment were subtle indicators of a life that went deeper than retail employment. Books on international relations and conflict resolution sat alongside technical manuals. A small collection of foreign currencies suggested travels to places not typically visited by tourists. And in his bedroom closet, behind rows of civilian clothes, hung a single military dress uniform with decorations that told a story of service in places and situations that officially didn't exist. His phone had been ringing all evening. Reporters, acquaintances, people he barely knew who had somehow gotten his number and wanted to talk about what had happened. He'd stopped answering after the fifth call. The truth was, Marcus had always known this day would come eventually. You couldn't hide that level of training indefinitely, especially if circumstances forced you to use it. He'd hoped for more time to establish a completely civilian identity, to build a life that had nothing to do with Ghost Company or Afghanistan or the classified operations that had defined his early adulthood. But Williams had been right earlier that day. The pretending was over. There was a knock at his door at 9:30 p.m. Marcus checked the peephole and saw Detective Monroe standing in the hallway, looking tired but determined. "Detective," he said, opening the door, "I thought we covered everything at the station." "We covered the robbery," she replied. "We didn't cover what comes next. May I come in?" Marcus stepped aside to let her enter. Monroe looked around the apartment, taking in the minimal furnishings and the sense that this was a place where someone lived but didn't necessarily belong. "Mr. Chen, I've been doing some additional research since our interview," she began. "Ghost Company wasn't just any military unit. According to what I've been able to learn, it was one of the most elite special operations groups deployed during the Afghanistan conflict. The kind of unit that handled missions other groups couldn't or wouldn't take on." Marcus remained standing near the door. "What's your point, Detective?" "My point is that people with your background don't usually end up working retail jobs in small Ohio towns unless they're running from something. And after what happened today, I'm concerned that whatever you might be running from has found you." The statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both of them understood but neither wanted to articulate directly. "Detective Monroe," Marcus said finally, "I appreciate your concern, but I chose this life. I chose this job, this town, this apartment. Nobody forced me to come here, and nobody is forcing me to stay." "But are you staying?" she asked. "Because something tells me that after today, staying might not be an option anymore." It was a question Marcus had been asking himself all evening, and he still didn't have an answer. 3 days after the robbery attempt, Marcus's carefully constructed civilian life began unraveling in ways he hadn't anticipated. The local news story had been picked up by regional outlets, then national ones, and by Tuesday morning, his phone was buzzing with calls from producers wanting to book him for interviews about everyday heroes and veterans in our communities. He'd turned them all down, but the attention had consequences beyond media requests. People recognized him now. Walking into the grocery store Tuesday evening, he noticed conversations stopping mid-sentence as customers turned to stare. The elderly woman at the checkout counter asked if he was that young man from the electronics store, and when he nodded politely, she launched into a 5-minute monologue about how wonderful it was to have real heroes living in their community. Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but hero worship made him deeply uncomfortable. Ghost Company's effectiveness had depended on anonymity, on the ability to move through civilian populations without drawing attention. Being recognized everywhere he went felt like wearing a target on his back. Wednesday morning brought a visitor he hadn't expected. Marcus was leaving his apartment complex when a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. 2 men in suits emerged, and he immediately recognized the type, if not the individuals. Federal agents, almost certainly, with the kind of bearing that came from years of investigating matters that required security clearances. "Mr. Chen," the older agent approached with credentials already in hand. "Agent Thompson, FBI. This is Agent Rodriguez. We'd like to speak with you about Saturday's incident." Marcus examined their badges carefully. Both were legitimate, both were from the Bureau's Cincinnati field office. "What aspect of the incident interests the FBI?" "The 3 men you subdued have connections to a criminal organization we've been investigating," Thompson explained. "We believe Saturday's robbery attempt may have been more than a random crime." They conducted the interview in Marcus's apartment, which felt increasingly small with 3 people, and the weight of federal investigation filling the space. Agent Rodriguez took notes while Thompson asked questions that revealed how much the Bureau already knew about Ghost Company operations and their potential ongoing implications. "We've been tracking a network that specializes in targeting former special operations personnel," Thompson explained. "They gather intelligence on veterans with valuable skills, then either attempt to recruit them for criminal activities or eliminate them as potential threats to their operations." Marcus poured coffee for his guests, a gesture of hospitality that also gave him time to process the information. "You're suggesting Saturday was an assassination attempt disguised as a robbery?"
"We're suggesting it's a possibility worth investigating," Rodriguez replied. "The three men who targeted your store had no criminal history in Ohio. They drove here from Detroit specifically for this job, which suggests they had specific intelligence about their target." The implications were troubling, but not entirely surprising. Marcus had always known that Ghost Company's operations had disrupted criminal networks with connections that extended far beyond Afghanistan. Drug trafficking routes, weapons smuggling operations, human trafficking networks all had been impacted by missions that officially never happened. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked. "Information," Thompson said. "We need to understand what Ghost Company did that might have made you a target. And we need to know if you've noticed anything unusual in the months leading up to Saturday's incident." Marcus spent the next 2 hours providing a careful account of his military service, focusing on operations that might have created ongoing security concerns. He described criminal networks that had been disrupted, high-value targets who had been captured or eliminated, and intelligence gathering that had exposed corruption reaching into civilian governments and international criminal organizations. "The problem," he explained, "is that Ghost Company operations were designed to have cascading effects. We didn't just complete individual missions, we created conditions that dismantled entire networks over time. Some of those networks had resources and connections that survived our deployment." Agent Rodriguez looked up from her notes. "Are you saying there could be multiple criminal organizations with reasons to target Ghost Company veterans?" "I'm saying that our unit's success created a lot of enemies, and some of those enemies have had 4 years to plan responses." The meeting concluded with the agents providing Marcus with contact information and security protocols. They couldn't offer protection, he wasn't officially a witness in any active federal case, but they could provide resources if he encountered additional threats. After they left, Marcus sat in his kitchen considering options he'd hoped never to face. The quiet civilian life he'd built in Riverside was no longer sustainable, but he wasn't sure what alternatives remained available. His phone rang at 2:30 p.m. The caller ID showed Jessica's number. "Marcus?" Her voice was tense. "Are you okay? There are news vans outside the store, and some guy with a camera tried to follow me home asking questions about you." "I'm fine," Marcus replied. "Are you safe?" "Yeah, I'm at my apartment. But Marcus, this is getting weird. Patricia called an emergency staff meeting for tomorrow morning, and the corporation sent some executives down from Columbus. I think they're trying to decide what to do about all the attention." Marcus had been expecting this call. Bell Electronics was a small regional chain that had never dealt with national media attention. Having one of their employees become a viral news story was creating complications that management wasn't equipped to handle. "Jessica," he said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever happens with my job, none of this is your fault or David's fault. You've both been good coworkers, and I'm sorry the situation has become complicated." "Wait, are you quitting?" "I'm considering my options." There was a long pause. "Marcus, can I ask you something? That first day I saw your tattoo, had you been planning to tell us eventually? About your military service, I mean." It was a fair question, and Marcus realized he owed her an honest answer. "No, I hadn't planned to tell anyone. I was trying to build a completely civilian life separate from everything I'd done before." "Why?" "Because I wanted to find out who Marcus Chen could be when he wasn't defined by what he'd done in the army. I wanted to discover if I could be normal." "And could you?" Jessica asked. "Be normal, I mean." Marcus looked around his sparse apartment, thinking about 8 months of retail shifts, customer service interactions, and the comfortable routine he'd established. For a while, yes, it was actually pretty good. But not anymore? "No," he admitted, "not anymore." Thursday morning staff meeting confirmed what Marcus had already suspected. Patricia Wells looked exhausted as she addressed the small group of employees who had gathered in the break room before the store opened. "I'm sure you've all seen the news coverage about Saturday's incident," she began. "While we're proud that Marcus acted to protect his coworkers and our customers, the attention has created some challenges for our store and the company." She paused, glancing at Marcus before continuing. "Corporate has decided that it would be best for everyone if Marcus transitioned to a different position within the company, possibly at a location that hasn't received media attention." David spoke up immediately. "That's not fair. Marcus didn't ask for any of this attention." "I understand the concern," Patricia replied, "but we have to consider the safety and comfort of all our employees. Having news crews and reporters regularly showing up isn't sustainable for normal business operations." Marcus had been listening without comment, but now he stood up. "Patricia, I appreciate everything Bell Electronics has done for me, but I think it would be better if I submit my resignation effective immediately." "Marcus, that's not necessary," she said quickly. "We're not firing you. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone."
I understand, and I'm grateful for that. But this situation isn't going to improve as long as I'm associated with the company. It's better for everyone if I move on. After the meeting, Marcus cleaned out his locker and said goodbye to his coworkers. David shook his hand with obvious respect, telling him that working with him had been an honor. Jessica hugged him, which surprised them both, and made him promise to stay in touch. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus replied honestly, "but I think it's time to stop pretending to be someone I'm not." That afternoon, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. The number was blocked, but the voice was familiar. First Sergeant Williams from the previous Saturday. "Sergeant Chen, I hope you don't mind me tracking down your number. I wanted to follow up on our conversation." "Not at all, First Sergeant. What can I do for you?" "Actually, it's what I might be able to do for you. I've been following the news coverage, and I've heard through certain channels that your situation has become complicated." Marcus was immediately alert. "What kind of channels?" "The kind that keep track of Ghost Company veterans and their current circumstances. There are people who've been concerned about your safety since Saturday's incident." "People?" "Other members of your unit, Marcus. They've been watching the news, and they're worried that what happened at the electronics store might not be the end of your problems." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a combination of relief and apprehension he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. "How many of them?" "Enough," Williams replied, "and they want to talk to you. There's going to be an informal gathering this weekend, and they'd like you to be there." "Where?" Williams provided an address in Kentucky, about 3 hours from Riverside. "Saturday evening, 7 p.m. Casual clothes, no need to bring anything except yourself." After ending the call, Marcus sat in his apartment considering what this invitation meant. For 4 years, he'd been deliberately isolated from his former life, avoiding contact with other Ghost Company veterans and the military community in general. He'd convinced himself that complete separation was necessary for successful civilian transition, but Saturday's events had proven that separation was an illusion. His past hadn't disappeared just because he'd stopped acknowledging it. And now, apparently, his former teammates were reaching out to remind him that some bonds couldn't be broken by time or distance. Friday evening, Marcus packed a small bag and prepared for the drive to Kentucky. He wasn't sure what he would find at this gathering, but he knew it represented a turning point. The quiet electronics store employee was gone forever, and it was time to discover what would take his place. As he locked his apartment door, Marcus realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. For the first time since leaving the military, he was moving towards his past instead of running from it, and that felt like the beginning of something important. The address Williams had provided led Marcus to a cabin deep in the Kentucky hills, 40 minutes from the nearest town, and accessible only by a winding gravel road that disappeared into dense forest. As he pulled into the clearing Saturday evening, Marcus counted 6 vehicles already parked in the shadows, pickup trucks and SUVs with license plates from different states, all chosen for their ability to blend into rural environments. The cabin itself was larger than it appeared from the outside, with additions that had been built to accommodate groups while maintaining the appearance of a simple hunting lodge. Warm light spilled from the windows, and Marcus could hear low voices and occasional laughter from inside. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 4 years, the particular camaraderie of soldiers who had shared experiences that couldn't be explained to anyone else. Before he could knock, the front door opened.
The man standing in the doorway was someone Marcus had hoped never to see again, not because of animosity, but because seeing him would make denial impossible. "Hello, Marcus." Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison looked older than his 32 years, with new lines around his eyes and gray threading through his dark hair. But his grip was still firm when he shook Marcus's hand, and his smile was genuine despite the weight both men carried from their shared past. "Jake," Marcus replied, "I wasn't sure you'd be here. Wouldn't miss it. Come on, everyone's waiting." The interior of the cabin was decorated with the casual comfort of a place meant for relaxation, but Marcus immediately noticed details that suggested it served other purposes. The windows had been upgraded with security film, the sightlines from each room provided excellent defensive positions, and the communications equipment visible in one corner was far more sophisticated than anything a hunting lodge would normally require. 5 other men stood as Marcus entered the main room. He recognized each face instantly, though all of them had changed in the 4 years since their deployment ended. They were older, some heavier, some thinner, all carrying the particular weariness that came from trying to fit military experiences into civilian frameworks that weren't designed to accommodate them. "Ghost Company," said Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, raising a beer bottle in a mock toast. "Still the ugliest bunch of operators the Army ever deployed." The laughter that followed was warm, but careful, reflecting relationships that had been forged under extreme circumstances and tested by years of separation. These men had trusted each other with their lives in Afghanistan, but civilian life had scattered them across the country into jobs and situations that none of them had discussed with each other until now. "So," said Sergeant First Class Kevin Walsh, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat, "we've all been following your adventures in retail. Have to say, taking down 3 armed robbers with nothing but customer service training was pretty impressive." "It wasn't customer service training," Marcus replied, accepting the beer that Morrison handed him. "No shit," said Specialist Brian Carter, the youngest member of their unit at 26. "But it's been interesting watching the news try to explain how a random electronics store employee managed to neutralize 3 criminals like he was still running operations in Kandahar."
The conversation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced since leaving the military. For the first time in 4 years, he was talking to people who understood not just what Ghost Company had done, but why those missions had been necessary and what accomplishing them had cost. "The thing nobody talks about," Rodriguez explained, "is that successful reintegration was always going to be impossible for our unit. We weren't regular infantry. We weren't even regular special forces. What we did over there required psychological adaptations that don't just disappear because you put on civilian clothes." Walsh nodded. "I tried the corporate route for 2 years, consulting, project management, the whole suit and tie thing. But sitting in conference rooms talking about quarterly projections when you've seen what we've seen, it's like trying to pretend you're someone else 24 hours a day." "What are you doing now?" Marcus asked. "Private security," Walsh replied. "Corporate clients, some government contracts. It's not the same as Ghost Company, but at least I'm using skills that matter." Carter leaned forward. "That's actually why we're all here, Marcus. We've been talking for months about the problems we've all faced trying to build normal civilian lives, and we think there might be a better way." Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a series of news articles and case files. "Remember those FBI agents who visited you? They weren't exaggerating about the scope of the problem. There are at least 6 criminal organizations operating in the United States that specifically target former special operations personnel, sometimes for recruitment, sometimes for elimination, always because they recognize us as threats to their operations." The articles described incidents across the country, veterans who had been attacked, threatened, or mysteriously killed in circumstances that suggested professional hits rather than random violence. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Someone was systematically targeting soldiers with specific skill sets and operational experience. "Here's what's interesting," Rodriguez continued. "In every case where the target survived, it was because they used the training and instincts that we all pretend don't exist anymore. The guys who tried to live completely civilian lives, who convinced themselves they could just forget everything they learned, those are the ones who didn't make it." Marcus studied the information, recognizing the implications immediately.
You're saying that hiding from our past makes us more vulnerable, not less. Exactly, Morrison said. And we're saying that maybe it's time to stop hiding. Carter pulled out a laptop and opened a presentation that had clearly been prepared in advance. We've been researching the legal framework for private military contractors operating on domestic soil. Turns out there's a lot more flexibility than most people realize, especially if you're providing protective services rather than offensive operations. The presentation outlined a business plan that was both ambitious and practical. A private security company staffed entirely by Ghost Company veterans, specializing in threat assessment and protection for clients who face risks that traditional security services couldn't handle. Corporate executives dealing with international criminal organizations, government officials receiving credible threats, other veterans who had been targeted for their military service. The advantage, Walsh explained, is that we already know how to work together. We understand each other's capabilities, we trust each other's judgment, and we have operational experience that can't be taught in any civilian training program. Marcus considered the proposal carefully. What about oversight, accountability? The kind of work you're describing could easily cross legal boundaries if it's not properly regulated. That's been our primary concern too, Morrison replied, which is why we've spent the last 6 months working with attorneys who specialize in private security law. Everything we do would be completely legal, fully documented, and subject to regular auditing by both state and federal authorities. Rodriguez added, "We're not talking about becoming mercenaries or vigilantes. We're talking about using our skills to protect people who need protection, within a framework that serves legitimate clients through legal channels." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering logistics, financing, legal structures, and operational protocols. Marcus found himself engaged in strategic planning discussions that reminded him why he'd been effective as a Ghost Company operator. These men understood complex problems and approached solutions with the kind of systematic thinking that had made their military unit successful. But beyond the practical considerations, Marcus realized he was experiencing something he'd been missing for 4 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal survival or civilian integration. The work they were proposing would allow him to use his training and experience to protect people who need protection, rather than hiding those capabilities behind a retail uniform. "There's one more thing," Morrison said as the evening wound down. "We've been in contact with other Ghost Company veterans who weren't part of tonight's discussion. Word is spreading that we're having this conversation, and there's interest from guys who are dealing with similar problems in their civilian lives." "How many?" Marcus asked. "Potentially 15 to 20, if everyone who's expressed interest follows through. Enough to staff a legitimate operation with multiple teams and comprehensive capabilities." Carter looked directly at Marcus. "The question is whether you're interested in joining something like this. Because what happened at your electronics store proved that you can't hide from who you are indefinitely. And frankly, we need someone with your operational experience and leadership capabilities." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, weighing considerations that went beyond simple career decisions. Joining this venture would mean permanently abandoning the civilian identity he'd spent 4 years building. It would mean accepting that Marcus Chen, electronics store employee, had been a temporary role rather than a genuine life change. But it would also mean using his training and experience for purposes that aligned with his values, working alongside people who understood his background without requiring explanations or apologies, and potentially helping other veterans who were struggling with similar transition challenges.
"I have one condition," Marcus said finally. "What's that?" Morrison asked. "If we do this, we do it right. Full legal compliance, transparent operations, and a mission statement that focuses on protection rather than enforcement. We help people who need help, we stay within legal boundaries, and we never become the kind of organization that creates the problems we're supposed to solve." Morrison smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Rodriguez raised his beer bottle again. "So, are we doing this?" Marcus looked around the room at the faces of men who had shared the most intense experiences of his life, who understood capabilities and burdens that he'd been carrying alone for 4 years, who were offering him an opportunity to build something meaningful from skills that had been gathering dust in civilian storage. "Yeah," he said, raising his own bottle. "Let's do this." The toast that followed was subdued but significant. These men were committing to a venture that would define the next phase of their lives, using experiences that had shaped them in ways their civilian communities could never understand. As the evening ended and arrangements were made for follow-up meetings, Marcus realized that the quiet electronics store employee who had spilled coffee on himself 1 week ago was finally, officially, gone forever. In his place was someone he'd been afraid to acknowledge for 4 years, a highly trained operator with valuable skills and hard-won experience, ready to use those capabilities in service of people who needed protection. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Marcus felt like he was moving towards something instead of running away from it. And that felt like coming home. 6 months after the Kentucky cabin meeting, Marcus Chen stood in the lobby of a Cincinnati office building that bore no resemblance to Bell Electronics. The marble floors and glass walls reflected the morning sun through floor-to-ceiling windows, while the discreet bronze placard near the elevator bank read simply, "Sentinel Strategic Solutions, 14th floor." The transformation had been more rapid than anyone had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of their reunion, Morrison had secured initial funding through a combination of veteran entrepreneurship grants and private investors who understood the market demand for sophisticated security services. By month 3, they had incorporated as a legitimate business entity with proper licensing, insurance, and legal oversight. By month 5, they were operational with their first contracted clients. Marcus rode the elevator to the 14th floor, where Sentinel Strategic Solutions occupied a suite of offices that balanced professional appearance with functional security requirements. The reception area looked like any other corporate consulting firm, but employees with security clearances recognized subtle details that indicated this wasn't a typical business environment. "Morning, Marcus," called Sarah Kim, their office manager and former Army intelligence analyst. "Your 9 a.m. appointment is already here. Conference Room B." The client waiting for Marcus was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a pharmaceutical researcher whose work on synthetic opioid antidotes had made her a target for criminal organizations that profited from the addiction crisis. She'd been receiving increasingly sophisticated threats for 3 months, and traditional security services had proven inadequate for protecting someone whose daily routine involved laboratory work in multiple secured facilities. "Dr. Vasquez," Marcus said, shaking her hand as he entered the conference room, "I've reviewed the threat assessment our team prepared. This is definitely something we can help you with." The meeting lasted 40 minutes, during which Marcus explained how Sentinel's approach differed from conventional security services. Rather than simply providing bodyguards, they would analyze the entire threat environment, identify vulnerabilities in her daily patterns, and implement countermeasures that allowed her to continue her research while minimizing risk. "The advantage we offer," Marcus explained, "is that our team has experience dealing with adversaries who use sophisticated surveillance, planning, and execution methods. We understand how professional criminals think because we've spent years disrupting their operations." After Dr. Vasquez left, Marcus walked through the office suite, checking in with team members who were working on various active cases. Rodriguez was coordinating protection for a federal judge whose rulings had angered international trafficking networks. Walsh was analyzing cybersecurity threats against a technology executive whose innovations were disrupting criminal money laundering operations. Carter was developing threat assessments for 3 different corporate clients facing risks that conventional security firms couldn't properly evaluate. The work was challenging, legally compliant, and professionally satisfying in ways that retail employment had never been. More importantly, it utilized skills and experience that Marcus had spent 4 years trying to forget, channeling them towards purposes that aligned with his values. "Marcus," Morrison called from his office, "can you come in here for a minute?" Morrison's office overlooked downtown Cincinnati, with a view that stretched to the Ohio River. The walls displayed framed certificates and awards, but also photographs from their Afghanistan deployment, images that reminded everyone who worked here of the experiences that had shaped their capabilities. "I just got off the phone with FBI agent Thompson," Morrison said, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat. "Remember those 3 guys who tried to rob your electronics store? The federal investigation has expanded significantly." Marcus settled into the chair across from Morrison's desk. "How so?" "Turns out the criminal network that targeted you is much larger than anyone realized. The Bureau has identified at least 47 incidents across 12 states where former Special Operations personnel were either attacked, threatened, or killed by what appeared to be random violence, but now looks like systematic targeting. The scope was staggering, but not entirely surprising. Ghost Company had disrupted criminal operations with international connections, and those organizations have resources and patience for long-term retaliation campaigns. Here's the interesting part, Morrison continued. Since Sentinel became operational, the targeting has decreased significantly in regions where we're active. The Bureau thinks our presence is serving as a deterrent. Criminals are less likely to target veterans when they know there's an organization specifically designed to protect them. Marcus considered the implications. They're asking us to expand our protective services to include other targeted veterans? Not exactly asking. More like strongly suggesting that there's a market opportunity that serves both business interests and national security concerns. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica Martinez. They'd stayed in touch since his resignation from Bell Electronics, exchanging occasional messages about local news and mutual acquaintances. But this message was different.
Turn on Channel 7 News right now. You're going to want to see this. Marcus pulled up the local news feed on his laptop, and Morrison moved around the desk to watch over his shoulder. The anchor was reporting on an attempted robbery at a different electronics store in Riverside, the same chain where Marcus had worked, but a location across town. The incident occurred yesterday evening when 3 armed men attempted to rob the Maple Avenue Bell Electronics store, the anchor reported. However, store employees successfully defended themselves using techniques they say they learned from Marcus Chen, the former employee who gained national attention 6 months ago for stopping a similar robbery. The story cut to an interview with David Brooks, who was now working at the Maple Avenue location as an assistant manager. After what happened with Marcus, all of us employees asked the company to provide self-defense training, David explained to the reporter. We couldn't do what Marcus did, obviously, but we learned enough to work together and protect ourselves until the police arrived. The footage showed the 3 would-be robbers in custody, looking significantly more battered than the criminals Marcus had encountered. The news report noted that this was the 4th attempted robbery of Bell Electronics stores in the past 3 months, suggesting a pattern of criminal targeting. Interesting, Morrison observed. Looks like your former coworkers took inspiration from your example. Marcus felt a complex mixture of pride and concern. David and the other employees had shown courage and initiative, but they'd also made themselves potential targets for the same criminal networks that had focused on him. His phone rang, and Detective Monroe's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mr. Chen," she said without preamble, "I assume you've seen the news about yesterday's robbery attempt." "Just watched it," Marcus replied. "We need to talk. This pattern of targeting Bell Electronics stores is connected to the investigation we discussed 6 months ago, and it's escalating in ways that concern federal authorities." They arranged to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory that allowed for a conversation that might touch on sensitive topics. Monroe arrived with Agent Thompson, which indicated that the situation had reached levels requiring federal coordination. The short version, Thompson explained once they were seated, is that the criminal organization targeting Special Operations veterans has expanded their operations to include anyone associated with those veterans. Co-workers, family members, businesses that employed them, anyone who might have information about their capabilities or current circumstances. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon weather. "They're targeting Jessica and David because they worked with me?" "Not directly," Monroe clarified, "but they're targeting Bell Electronics stores because your employment there became public knowledge. The thinking seems to be that other stores in the chain might employ additional veterans with valuable skills." Thompson leaned forward. "Here's what we're proposing. The Bureau has authorization to contract with private security firms for protective services in cases involving organized criminal threats. We'd like Sentinel Strategic Solutions to provide security consultation for Bell Electronics locations in this region." The proposal was professionally intriguing but personally complicated. Returning to protect his former workplace would mean acknowledging connections that he'd spent months trying to distance himself from. But it would also mean ensuring the safety of people who had shown him kindness during his civilian experiment. "I'll need to discuss this with my team," Marcus said. "Of course, but we'd appreciate a decision quickly. Intelligence suggests the criminal organization is planning something more ambitious than individual store robberies." That evening, Marcus drove back to Riverside for the first time since leaving 6 months earlier. The town looked exactly the same, but his perspective had changed dramatically. He no longer saw it as a place to hide from his past, but as a community that had provided him temporary sanctuary during a difficult transition period. He parked outside Bell Electronics on Maple Street, where the lights were still on despite the late hour. Through the windows, he could see Jessica and David working together to reorganize inventory that had been disrupted during the previous day's robbery attempt. Marcus knocked on the glass door, and Jessica looked up with surprise and immediate relief. She unlocked the door and stepped outside, giving him a hug that conveyed months of worry and concern. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said. "Things have been weird since you left. Not just the robbery attempts, but people asking questions about you, strangers hanging around the parking lot, stuff that doesn't feel right." David emerged from the store and shook Marcus's hand with genuine enthusiasm. "Man, it's good to see you. We've been following Sentinel Strategic Solutions online. Looks like you found your calling." "It's been a good fit," Marcus agreed, "but I'm here because I'm concerned about your safety. The FBI thinks the recent robberies are connected to my former employment here." Jessica's expression grew serious. "So we're in danger because we used to work with you?" "Potentially, but there are things we can do to change that situation." Over the next hour, Marcus explained the federal contract proposal and what Sentinel's involvement would mean for Bell Electronics employees. Professional security assessment, employee training, coordinated response protocols, and ongoing monitoring of potential threats. Basically, he concluded, we'd make sure that anyone targeting this store would face the same kind of response they encountered when they tried to rob me 6 months ago. David grinned. "So you're offering to protect us using the same skills that made you a local legend?" "I'm offering to ensure that my former coworkers don't become casualties in a conflict they didn't choose to join." Jessica studied his face carefully. "Marcus, are you happy now? With Sentinel, I mean. Does it feel like the right choice?" The question was more perceptive than he'd expected. "Yes," he said, after considering his answer. "For the first time since leaving the military, I feel like I'm using my capabilities for their intended purpose, protecting people who need protection." "Then we accept," Jessica said firmly, "whatever you and your team need to keep everyone safe." David nodded agreement. "Besides, it'll be nice having you around again, even if it's in a professional capacity." 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the same Bell Electronics store where his civilian cover had been blown 6 months earlier. But now he was there as the senior security consultant for Sentinel Strategic Solutions, wearing a suit instead of a uniform shirt, carrying credentials instead of a name tag.
The store had been quietly transformed with security upgrades that were invisible to casual customers, but would be immediately apparent to anyone planning criminal activity. Surveillance systems, communication protocols, emergency response procedures, and employee training had created a protective environment that maintained normal business operations while deterring potential threats. More importantly, the criminal organization that had been targeting veterans and their associates had moved their operations to other regions after encountering Sentinel's protective measures. The deterrent effect that Morrison had mentioned was proving to be more powerful than anyone had anticipated. "Mr. Chen?" A customer approached the counter where Marcus was reviewing security reports with Jessica. "Aren't you the guy who stopped those robbers here a few months ago?" "I'm the security consultant," Marcus replied politely. "Is there anything I can help you with today?" After the customer left, Jessica smiled at him. "Still trying to stay low profile?" "Not hiding anymore," Marcus said, "just focusing on the work that matters." Through the store's front windows, Marcus could see the Sentinel Strategic Solutions vehicle parked discreetly across the street where Rodriguez was monitoring the surrounding area for potential threats. Other team members were positioned at strategic locations throughout the shopping district, providing layered security that protected not just Bell Electronics but the entire community.
It was professional, effective, and completely legal. More importantly, it represented the successful integration of military capabilities with civilian protection needs, creating something that served both veteran transition requirements and community safety concerns. Marcus Chen, the quiet electronics store employee who had spilled coffee on himself and tried to live an unremarkable life, was gone forever. In his place was Marcus Chen, a security professional using extraordinary skills for ordinary purposes, keeping good people safe from those who would harm them. And for the first time in years, that felt exactly right. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. In a world where threats came from criminal organizations with sophisticated capabilities, there would always be people who needed the kind of protection that only former ghost company operators could provide. Marcus was finally home, not in a place, but in a purpose that aligned with who he had always been, even when he'd been trying to be someone else. Outside, the sun set over Riverside, Ohio, casting long shadows across a community that was safer than it knew, protected by guardians who had learned to serve again. The quiet heroes had found their calling. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.